Morning, everyone. We are in our Bibles. We're in Deuteronomy chapter 34 as we address the death of Moses real quick at the very end of lesson 15. If you're looking at the lesson sheets, and then moving into lesson 16 this morning, as we just kind of didn't quite get Wednesday night, didn't quite get finished with 15 because we need to at least speak to the death of Moses here at the very end of all this. And wrap up that portion of the history before we move into the talking about the conquest of the promised land. And so that's what we'll be doing this morning. And so pick up with me, if you would, in Deuteronomy chapter 34 as we examine this. So, as you recall, because at what moment did Moses, and sometimes we may get mixed up about when exactly God prescribed certain punishments or things, but what did Moses do that ultimately led him to not be permitted into the promised land? Okay, what scene was that? Okay, so God told him to speak to the rock, but he struck the rock instead. But more importantly, maybe, is the fact that then he turns to the people and said, "Must we bring water from this rock for you rebels?" And he takes the glory in some senses to himself. It's interesting. I've always been fascinated in some ways by the fact that God still what? God still brought the water. Even though Moses didn't exactly do what God wanted him to do, he still brought the water. And so I've always contended that tells me a little bit about the idea that maybe we need to make sure we're emphasizing that it was not just the idea that Moses didn't do exactly what God had said. It's just as much or more about the idea that Moses wasn't honoring God in what he was doing and giving to God the glory for that. And so he paid a heavy price for it. The price is you're not going to go into the promised land, but I will allow you to what? Will allow you to see it. And that's where we are here in Deuteronomy chapter 34. We're at that moment where God's going to allow for Moses to see it, and he's going to have to do what in order to see a large portion of it? He's going to have to go up on the mountaintop. And so he goes up from the plains of Moab, verse 1 of chapter 34, unto the mountain of Nebo to the top of Pisgah, that is over against Jericho, and the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead unto Dan, and all of Naphtali, and the land. By the way, had those places been? We're looking. He's kind of talking about it in an after the fact sense. It's being defined as to what will be drawn as the boundaries of those places once they actually go and conquest the land. But when he's trying to give future readers a visual of what Moses was seeing, we learned that it's all of Naphtali, land of Ephraim, Manasseh, part of Dan, land of Gilead, all the land of Judah unto the utmost sea, the south and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees unto Zor. He's seeing what? I guess if you take that in a generic sense. She hasn't seen all of it, right? He's seeing a large portion of what God had promised to whom? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember, this has never, now let me rephrase that a little bit here. The allowance or the continuation of the Israelites getting back to the promised land and inheriting this great place that God intended for them ultimately relates back to the origins of the promise made to Abraham. God had been so frustrated with them up through many of the scenes and circumstances that he had witnessed from them that he was ready to what? He's just ready to be done. But I'm going to fulfill the original promise that I made that was passed from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. What's happening here, though this generation, this younger generation that grew up and is going to go and conquest the land, is going to find favor in the eyes of God for a period of time. This is just as much or more about the idea of God honoring what he originally promised as they're heading in to that promised land. Verse 5. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab over against Beth Peor. So we got a proximity, but not a what? Not an exact location. But no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. And Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. Oh, what a grand feeling that would have been, right? To think that you lived 120 years, and through that time span, your strength and your countenance, in some senses, never changed. You can't even go 40 years nowadays without having problems, right? And we all know what happens when you turn 50. At least I do. And anyway, but it's amazing. But that was because God had purpose and work and things that Moses needed to accomplish. And in many senses, they were going to be physically what? Yeah, they're going to be physically demanding on him to be able to lead these people in a physical sense out of Egypt towards the promised land in a detoured, indirect route. 40 years of wandering. Don't forget, Moses is with them right up until the end here of that 40-year period. And then ultimately, he dies there, and no one knows where he was buried. I'm cautious to not be overly speculative about that. God didn't tell us why he did it that way. I've got my assumptions, right? You could only imagine what they might have done with the burial place of Moses had they known where it was. You can almost see the idolatry on the horizon of a shrine to Moses that could potentially occur. That could be one reason. But truth is, we don't really know. God's choice. He dies there. God buries him. Nobody knows. But they do know he what in verse 8? They do know he died. And it's interesting, as is the case even in modern times, Moses gets more respect in death than he did among the living. Isn't that sad? But it's true. Moses had headache after headache after headache after headache with the people. Now, admittedly, by the time Moses dies, who else has died? Well, Aaron, but who else generically? Yeah, that whole generation that caused all those gripes and complaints and arguments against, they're also gone. Because that was the whole point. We'll see a little bit of that in lesson 16 as defining who those people were, and kind of a rough way, actually, that how you could tell the difference between those who were part of that first generation and the new one. But Moses here dies, is buried, and they mourn, they weep for 30 days in this moment. It's a sad scene. Somewhat reminiscent, I think it's Genesis chapter 52, when Joseph takes his father back to the promised land. Even the Egyptians mourn, I believe, for their 70 days. I think that mourning lasted, maybe it's 40. I'll have to go back and look at that. Go ahead, Bob. No indication in the text that that's the case. There's nothing. All I know is what he saw, and how that happens. Required a mountain, required him for. I think if this was just going to be completely a miraculous event, that could have happened without him going anywhere. But he goes up on us. So no indication in the narrative that there was any miraculous happening here that I can see. I get you though. And I suppose in some ways you're seeing it but not seeing it. If you understand what I mean, you're seeing it. You can go over into Canaan Valley, West Virginia, and go up on the top, and you're seeing multiple states. You're seeing, but you don't know in some senses. You know what I mean? But you're seeing it, even though you couldn't necessarily know exactly where those boundaries were by your own vision as it relates to that. But it's interesting, though, as it relates to that, verse 7 says not only was his natural force his strength, but what else was working pretty good still? His eyesight. Specifically mentioned that his eyesight was still working. It hadn't dimmed at all, as it would have for most people that had been 120 years old. And so Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him, and the children of Israel hearkened unto him, and did as the Lord commanded Moses. And so instructions came to Moses. Moses passes them on to Joshua. Joshua becomes now the leader of the people. And the important factor here is simply that the people embrace that idea. They're ready to be led by Joshua. And they're accepting of Moses' choice in a sense that he's the successor, and it's time, right? They've been waiting and waiting and waiting, and it's time to go and fulfill the promises that God had intended. There's a quick question at the end of lesson 15 that simply asks, did Moses' sin at Kadesh keep him from going to heaven? And the answer, and I guess is the way he's driving, is no. God's punishment was about the physical consequence of him not going to the physical promised land, not his eternal condition in relationship to God. And number one, the narrative doesn't really address that issue. Number two, though, we generally point to what to kind of illustrate that? The Mount Transfiguration, right? You come into the New Testament, you see that scene where Jesus has those three disciples with him, and they're at the Mount, and they see Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. And so you see in the presence of God there, and the benefit of seeing this visual representation of the law, prophets, and Jesus there. And most conclude then if Moses is represented and seen, visibly seen, there at the Mount of Transfiguration, the basic conclusion is that he's in an eternal positive relationship with God at that point. Thoughts or questions left over about that lesson? All right, lesson 16. Let's jump. Let's start talking about the work of Joshua. So let's go to Joshua chapter 1. So Moses' death kind of concludes, if you will, that 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And Joshua tells the people, it's time to rise up, go over this Jordan, all this people unto the land which I do give to them, even to the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, have I given unto you, as I said unto Moses. And so it's time to go take it, but who's still providing? God is. Everywhere your foot touches that you're able to conquest and possess, that's all happening because of the work of God and the purposes that He intended for them. Notice, if you would, with me, verse 5. There shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. I will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. And God's promises to Joshua, just as I was with Moses, I will be with you. And I'm going to care for you and strengthen you and guide you through all of those things. So what should Joshua's response to that be? Verse 6. Yeah, be strong. Be courageous here. For unto this people shalt thou divide for an inheritance the land which I swear unto their fathers to give them. This, though it's time, though God's going to be with them, though God's going to guide them, provide for them, all of those things, but is the work going to be easy? No, it's going to be challenging. Not only just the actual act of conquesting the land, but as is common to the people, there are going to be problems that arise from where? from within, right? From within the people themselves. It's not just going to be the battles and challenges that they have with the people who are currently living there, but it's also going to be the problems that arise among the people themselves as they go to take and conquest the land. Be strong and very courageous, that thou mayest observe to do according to what? All the law which Moses my servant commanded thee. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest. And so the promise to go and possess the land is going to be honored because the promise made to whom, we said earlier? To Abraham. Their ability to continue to prosper and benefit from that is contingent upon what? Yeah, and their honoring of the law. And so the original promise, no condition. I'm doing it. I made a promise to Abraham. It came through Isaac. It came through Jacob. It's continuing through you. I'm fulfilling it, God says. But the continuing prosperity and the continuing benefit to the people is contingent upon how you behave. And do we know that to be true? Yes, because all you got to do is read their history, right? And see what happens when they depart from God. Consequence came. When they're with Him, reward returns. And so this on again, off again, if you will, relationship they had with God is evidenced in their history. And so he tells them, stick with the law and good things shall happen. The book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success. If they were going to abide by the law, and if those leading them were going to guide them in that path, then what were they going to have to do in relationship to that law? Keep it, obey it, but you can't keep it and obey. You got to know it. You got to know it. And if you're going to know it, then you need to spend how much time with it? A lot. And he said, to define that, he said, do it day and night. You got to spend a lot of time with it. You've got to understand it. You know, I don't know how to necessarily pick an analogy here, but I suppose we're not in very many life or death kinds of situations, I suppose. But if we had some job or occupation, and the safety of doing that job depended on me following certain guidelines and rules and doing things in a proper manner, I would probably do what with that manual? I'd learn. That's right. I'd study it. I'd learn it. I would backwards, forwards. I would want to know every single detail I could because my life depends. And potentially the life of whom? Others. We got some pretty nasty stuff that's about 20 miles from here, don't we? You guys that work in those plants know it. And our lives, not just theirs sitting there, but the lives of the people living in and around this valley depend on the guys standing inside those factories knowing what they're doing, right? And doing it the right way. Their life depends on it. Others' lives depend. Here's my point. My eternal life depends on how much time I spend in the book. Knowing and understanding the will of God. I can't apply it. I can't live it. I can't obey it. I can't keep it if I don't know it. It starts with the knowledge. It doesn't end there. I could know it frontwards or backwards and not live it. I could understand every thought and every description and every text that God has had written for us and not live it. And so it's more than knowledge. But I got to know it first. And so their commendation, first and foremost, was I want you to obey it, but you're going to spend time with it. Our lives depend on how much we're willing to put in the effort to know the will of God and then engage our lives in it. And that's an important aspect for us. It was an important aspect for them. In fact, Gary and I were talking the other day. That's our next study in our class here, actually. It's similar to that kind of thinking. But it's an important aspect. So, question 1 asked then, if you're looking at your outline sheets there in lesson 16, since Joshua's success depended upon obedience, what should he do day and night? Study it, know it, look at it, observe it, meditate upon it. Israel was to cross the Jordan River within, sorry, I didn't get to that verse, but how many days? They're in 3 days. So we're close, right? The idea here is that we're close to the time in which they're going to go and conquest the land. So, fast forwarding then to chapter 2. As we did in when we were originally going to take the promised land, how many spies were sent in? So I went around each tribe, right, and picked a man, an honorable one we'd hoped. Didn't quite turn out that way in relationship to when they came back and gave the evil report. But this time we're sending what? Sending 2 in here. And where are they specifically going? Yeah, so go view the land. Notice that there, Joshua sends them out, 2 men to spy secretly, saying, go view the land, even Jericho. Why was Jericho significant? Okay, first city, and it's a what? It's fortified. Okay, you want to give people a shot in the arm of confidence that this can be done, then you make your first battle in a fortified city, right? As you go to and you prove to those people before they ever set another foot outside, God is going to deliver. He can even deliver a place like Jericho. And if He can deliver Jericho, He can deliver the rest of the promised land as well. And so they get into Jericho, and what do? They need to find a place to stay, and so they go into the home of a harlot named Rahab, and they lodge there. And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, behold, there came men in hither tonight of the children of Israel to search out the country. So their well-kept secret didn't stay a well-kept secret, right? They were supposed to go in secretly, but it didn't take long for people to figure out. We got a couple of guys from those. And remember the visual. As you look out and see Israel camped outside here, right? It's an enormous number of people that are out there. They're just not this encampment isn't a couple hundred. So people are aware of what's going on. So the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, bring forth the men that are come to thee, which are entered into thine house, for they be come to search out all the country. And the woman took the 2 men and hid them, and said thus, there came men unto me, but I wist not whence they were. She does what, basically? She lies, okay? We would call that a lie. I know every time you get into this narrative, everybody wants to talk about, situation ethics and that kind of thing. It has nothing to do with this text. This text is about fulfilling whose purpose and work? God's work. That's it. At the end of the day, this is not a narrative about example and permissions and non-permissions and situation ethics. It's not about any of that. It's about what does God need to occur in order for the people to be able to go and conquest the land. And so He needs these 2 spies to be able to bring back the information that they need, and she protects them. The second thought I want you to recognize is simply this. Who told Rahab to lie? Nobody. Okay? Except maybe her what? Her own conscience, right? I don't know that there's a text. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but anybody said. Now, I'm sure the men are wanting protected. I'm sure you understand. But it's her conscience and her thoughts and what she's choosing because of her own understanding of what's going on with these people that she decides to do that. So this text is not, and my simple point is this text is not about a permission. It's not about an example about lying in a certain situation. This is simply what Rahab chose to do in the situation, and it was her choice to make, and she made it. And that's it. And it fulfills the purpose needed to protect the spies in that circumstance.
She maybe heard what had happened before.
Well, there's no doubt she understands. She's built a greater faith than some of the Israelites had, just on the information and testimony of those who had witnessed and seen what the people had done. And so she's already developed a faith in Jehovah without ever having actually been around the Israelite people to get there.
She goes on to say about how he heard how the Lord dried up the water.
Yeah. So she's fully aware of things that had happened even from when they came out of Egypt, and also the things that had been done even during that time that they had wandered in the wilderness. So she tells them when the gates get shut, when it's dark, and if you run real quick, you might what? You might catch them. But she had brought them up to the roof of the house and hid them with the stalks of flax which she had laid in order upon the roof. And so the men did. They took off, trying to find them by the Jordan under the fords. And as soon as they, which pursued after them, were going out, they shut the gate. Before they were laid down, she came up unto them upon the roof, and she said to the men, I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea when you came out of Egypt. What you did unto the two kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. As soon as we had heard these things, our hearts did melt. She's talking about who's the we. Yeah, that's people, right? People that are living there had been hearing all these things, and they're becoming pretty anxious because what's next for us? This is what they did to Og. This is what they did to Sihon. They're camped outside there. What's next for us? And so there's enough evidence that they'd been hearing about that their heart has melted. And not just melted, but neither did there remain what? There's no fight in them. Okay? Just the mere information of what God had already done for the Israelites has taken the fight out of those living in Jericho before it ever happened. Before the walls ever come down, they have already had the life drawn out of them. And not much will to fight. So now therefore pray you, swear unto me by the Lord, since I have showed you kindness, that you will also show kindness unto my father's house, and give me a true token. Now I want to be cautious here, but I do want to at least consider a human reality here. So Rahab lies by what appears to be her own choosing. And what's her hope to gain out of that? Protection, right? Okay. So her choices, we can see why she might do that. Again, is not a conversation about was she right or permitted or is it okay. It's simply a result of her human condition of deciding that if I protect them, maybe I can gain favor to where they'll protect me and my family, my father's house. And she wants evidence that that will be true. That you will save alive my father and my mother and my brethren and my sisters and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. Now that's interesting too, because don't forget she's alive. I can't happen but to wonder about the strained relationship between a daughter who had turned to harlotry and her family members. And yet she's still concerned about them, so that she would want to protect. Now again, I'm reading between the lines a little bit, and I don't know anything about the relationship. I'm just throwing human thought into the equation. But it is interesting. Now, again, we don't know. Family might have understood the anyway, but it's just interesting to think about. You can't help but wonder what that relationship was like, considering her life choice, and yet she still wants all of them protected from the deluge that's coming. And so they say to her, "Our life or yours, if you utter not what." If you don't say anything about it, about our business, it shall be, when the Lord hath given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with thee. I want you to quickly run over to the New Testament for a moment in James chapter 2, verse 25 in particular. That's funny. I saw batteries for that pen in my bag today, and I thought, I haven't changed the battery in this pen in a while. I should have changed it because it's already just quit working. So, weird. James chapter 2. If I can do it with my finger. My fingers are too big. James chapter 2, verse 25. So likewise also was not Rahab the harlot justified by what? Works. She had faith, but her actions are what proved herself before God when she had received the messengers and had sent them out another way, and her protection of them. It's amazing that her faith has motivated her enough. And her life's on the line either way, right? If she's right about the Israelites and doesn't protect these spies, then she's going to die when they come and take the land anyway. If she's found out to be a liar and the people of the city are successful in defending the city, then she's what? She's going to die too. So she's got to balance these two life issues. Which one? And so her faith kicks in, and her belief and confidence that those things that she had heard about the Israelites and their God were true. That's where I'm putting my faith. And not just in words, but in her very actions that put her life at risk if she's wrong. If she's wrong. Let me explore that thought just for a moment with you. And I don't want to try not to react to this question. Okay, I'm giving you permission to give a non-reaction to the question. But have you ever thought in your walk as a Christian, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong? Now again, I'm not trying to put you on the spot and want you to tell me. That's why I said give me a non-reaction to where I react, but I want you to think about it. And those moments in our walk of faith, we've got to make a choice, right? And even when the seeds of doubt are kicking in, and I promise you, her heart had to have been racing when she's standing in front of these men that the king sent to her home, and they're saying, we know they're here. And she has to take a big old gulp of air, heart going like this, and make a choice. And overcome any doubt or any fear or any wonders in her mind whether she's going the right direction here or not, and make the choice to send those men in a different direction. When she knows that that very decision and choice could cost her her life if those men realize they've been lied to and they come back to deal with her because of it. That is when our faith, number one, is tested. But with every moment like that in life that we conquer those doubts and fears and trepidations, our faith grows stronger. We get stronger. Yeah, yeah. And so we've got to make choices like that sometimes in life. And we've got to make decisions and overcome some of those moments where what if I'm wrong? And the seeds of doubt. And I've often said, Satan doesn't have to convince you that everything in the Bible is wrong. He just has to throw seeds of doubt at you once in a while to get you and I to consider whether I'm going to walk away from it all or not. His effort in many ways is simpler than the effort to stay faithful and stay confident in that relationship. It's a great part. We could preach lesson after lesson after lesson after lesson out of the story of Rahab, but it's just a great illustration for us of what am I going to do when those moments come. And Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31 puts her in that example of those witnesses of faith there as well. Question 3, if you're looking at your lesson sheets real quick here, and we're quickly running out of time. But true or false, Rahab thought the Israelites made it across the Red Sea because of a low tide. False. And by the way, they could have rationalized, right? They could rationalize that. They could have rationalized that well, we heard about this story, but probably just a real narrow section, low tide. Anybody could do that. I'm told that there were days where you could walk across this river right out here at certain moments in time, particularly before all the navigational dams were put in place, and all the dredging has occurred over the years. But anyway, so they could rationalize, but no, she didn't believe that was the case at all. She believed God did it. The fear of God caused the Canaanites to repent and put away their idols. And it's interesting, isn't it? On one side, they have no courage to fight because they've heard of the success rate of what had been happening with those Israelites and the things their God had done, but not enough to do anything about it or to react to it. Who does James pair Rahab with as an example of active faith? Yeah. And it's an amazing illustration when you think about, here's this, and maybe here, again, I could keep preaching lessons about Rahab, but here's the great part about Rahab. The most unlikely, right? And not only is she mentioned in the same breath of Abraham, but she's also in what? She's also in the lineage of Jesus. It's amazing. God can use anybody. You willing to turn and change and start acting by faith and living by faith and removing the doubts and serving the Lord, He can use anybody. And Rahab is a beautiful and perfect example of that, even as she finds herself in the list of the lineage of Jesus and even in comparison to men like Abraham and others who were great witnesses of faith. So before we can conquest the land here in our last minute and a half or so, we got to do what? We got to go across what? We got to get across Jordan. It's a great natural barrier. If you're in those days, water has been a natural barrier between you and your enemies for a long, long time. And in some ways, it's still even in modern time. Now, of course, nowadays we just do what? If we're going to battle, we just fly over it. Just fly over it. But in those days, it was a tremendous benefit to be able to have a barrier like a body of water that was protecting you from most pursuing armies that were coming by foot or maybe some chariots or horsemen. But they've got to, but they're going to find pretty quick that doesn't serve as much of a barrier when you're dealing with God, because He's going to create a way for them to cross it. And we shall start talking about that, Lord willing,